today is entitled When Push Comes to Shove, and the scripture passage for today's reading is found in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind calmed down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." My title today, When Push Comes to Shove, is actually something that I borrowed from a sermon in Pulpit Resource this week by, I think he's a Methodist minister, Will Willimon, and his sermon was not titled that, but in his sermon he had a few references, and he would say of Peter's faith, when push comes to shove. And I like that line, so I brought it for my title. And it's a common phrase, that people have used for years, when push comes to shove. And but I don't know if you've ever looked it up to see what it actually means. I didn't actually know what does it mean, so I looked it up on Wikipictionary. And it's figuratively idiomatic phrase when the pressure is on. So when push comes to shove, that's when the pressure is on. When the situation is critical or urgent. When the time has come for action, even if it is difficult. Well, I think when we hear today's story, it's pretty easy to see that the disciples in that boat out on the lake, being tossed about by the wind and possibly rain, they were in a situation when push comes to shove. It was a critical moment. It was a matter of urgency, and it was a time for action. But what action could they take? How many of you have ever actually been out on a lake in a boat with oars trying to row the boat? Raise your hand if you've rowed a boat before. Okay, because I've done that. When my father-in-law introduced me to fishing, he taught me how to row the boat. And even on a calm lake, after you row for a while, your arms get tired. Well, these disciples were out on that lake, and it was like a bird trying to fly into the wind. How are you going to get to the other shore if you're rowing against the wind? They were tired. They were exhausted. It was the middle of the morning, for goodness sake. And so even though it was time for action, what action could they take? As if that wasn't bad enough, not knowing what to do next, all of a sudden they look up and they see somebody walking towards them on the water. Have you ever seen anybody walking on the water? I haven't. They hadn't either. And so they were frightened. Naturally, they were frightened. I think I'd be frightened too. Well, of course, knowing what I know, I might assume it's Jesus doing it again. But if I didn't know that, I probably would have been frightened, And yet, when they started crying out that it's a ghost, Jesus tried to reassure his disciples. He was always doing that, wasn't he? You look through the New Testament, you see time and time and time again where the disciples, their faith isn't as strong as it needs to be for the situation. And what does Jesus do? He always reassures them. Do not be afraid, it's me. And then what does Peter say? Lord, if it's you. Okay, now, these are the guys that have been going around the countryside with Jesus. They just left him from a feast where he fed over 5,000 men plus their wives and children. So we can assume probably 12 or 13,000 people. He fed them with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Peter says, if it's you. Who else is going to be walking on the water except this guy that they've been following, watching him doing miracle after miracle? They saw him turn water into wine at a wedding. Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you. Peter was probably the brashest disciple of all. You might even say that he had a tendency to showboat. And yet when push comes to shove, so many times his faith falters. So he steps out onto the water and he's doing it. Look at this, man. Hey guys, look, Jesus is walking on the water and so am I. Isn't that cool? I think Peter was just getting ready to say, come on guys, you can do it too. But he looked around and the wind was still blowing. That's what's amazing. Jesus had not yet calmed the storm. It was still storming out. Can you see that boat just rocking back and forth like this? And Peter's out there walking on the water on top of the waves. But he looks at the wind and all of a sudden, what happens? When push came to shove, his fear and his doubt became stronger than his faith. And what happened when that happened? Starts to sink in the water. Right away, what does he do? He calls out, Lord, help me. I don't know about the rest of you, but when my faith falters, and it does, my first gut reaction is always, Lord, help me. That's a natural instinct, I think, for humans who have discovered their connection to God. They're a God that's bigger than we are, to a higher source, a higher power than ourselves. To cry out, Lord, help me. I'm sinking, I'm drowning, help me, Lord. And what did Jesus do? Immediately grabbed his hand and saved him, but then said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, I'm thinking that there are plenty of times when we find ourselves in a situation where push comes to shove. And I'm sure it came in Jesus' life too. Look at all of the different times that he was confronted by disbelievers, when he was confronted by people, church leaders of his own faith, accusing him, criticizing him, attacking him, doubting him, and even fearing him. When push comes to shove, what does Jesus do? Well, I think he prays about it. In fact, our scriptures said that after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. I wonder if his disciples ever thought about the fact that Jesus had pressure too, that Jesus had problems, that he needed to get away, to go into his closet up on a mountainside by himself to connect to God. That's what we need to do when our faith falters. When push comes to shove and we find out that our faith isn't strong enough for the task, when our doubts and our fears start to become bigger than our faith, we need to reach out. Put that hand up and say, Lord, save me. And trust that he will do it. When Gene and Larry were playing our special music, Love Lifted Me, I remembered that I actually ran a copy of the song because there were some words in there that I think were so appropriate. In fact, this song was written in response to our scriptures today. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry. From the waters lifted me. How saved am I? How many times have we felt that saving grace of Jesus in our lives when we've gone through the dark waters, through the difficult times, through the frightening and scary times? Jesus is always right there by our side, ready to grab our hand, pull us up out of the waters that seem to be overwhelming us. Whether it's grief or fear or pain or anger or resentment or whatever it is that is trying to pull us down in our faith, Jesus is there to reassure us, to pull us up and to save us. I can tell you there are some humorous times when it has happened to me. Just this past Wednesday night, for example, I had all of these really good notes for the memorial service for Adam Wisman's father, Chris Wisman. In fact, Adam and I were up here at the computer because Isaac Zoomed the memorial service to members of Chris's family. That was pretty cool, you know. I'm so grateful for Isaac, you know, because, Jim introduced our church to Zoom before Isaac moved back home for a period of time, but Isaac has taken over Zoom and, you know, taken us to the next level and the next level to be able to do Zoom better. And Adam knew that we'd been doing Zoom, and so he checked with Isaac to see if Isaac could Zoom it to members of his family that weren't going to be here. So Adam and I were up here looking at our computer, and we were going over some of my notes. And then the service was supposed to start at 6 o'clock. I came up and my notes were nowhere to be found. Well, for about the next 10 or 15 minutes, I ran around like a chicken with my head cut off, as did members of the family, looking for my notes. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, I said to Adam, should we just wing it? He said, yeah, go ahead and wing it. That was when push comes to shove. Trust me on this, my memory has never been great. If you don't believe me, you just ask Diane, she'll tell you. But I said, Lord, help me. And he helped me through that memorial service. And it really went pretty well. I guess because of my conversation with Adam, getting the information and putting it together, it somehow stuck in the back of my mind. And when I cried out, Lord, help me, I knew that I could count on him, and he did. I had a similar thing happen early in my ministry years ago. Gosh, it must have been about 20 years ago. Matt Blevins had moved to Tennessee with his family when he was probably about 13 years old, and then he grew up and he went to college and he met a beautiful woman, and they got engaged. They wanted me to come down and do their wedding. I don't normally travel 450 miles to do a wedding, but these people were special to me. And so we went down, went down there. They put me up in this nice hotel, and everything was beautiful and perfect the night of the rehearsal. And the next day, the cab came and got me and took me to Centennial Park in downtown Nashville. And then while I'm talking with Matt, I realized that the wedding ceremony is back at the hotel. We don't have time to go back and get it. So I said, Matt, what are we going to do? You would have loved Matt. Just the kindest, gentlest soul you've ever met in your life, with so much respect. And he says, well, now he's from here. But now, bear in mind, he moved down to Tennessee with his family when he was about 13 years old. Now he's 22. And he says, well, now, Mr. Glad. He said, I've got enough confidence in you, and I think you've done enough weddings. You can wing this. Oh, well, thank you, Matt. I'm glad you have so much confidence. Oh, just one thing, Mr. Dwight. I said, yeah, what's that? He said, let's not tell until after it's over. And so even in that situation, I had done a few weddings. I reached out my hand, I said, Lord, help me. And we got through that service, and everybody said it was a beautiful service, and they loved it. Not because of me, mind you. You see, my efforts failed. My faith was faltering. I didn't know what to do. But when I asked Matt, it was like Jesus was speaking through Matt, says, well, now, Mr. Dwight, I have confidence in your ability, and you've done so many weddings. Okay, then, let's do it. I reached out my hand, Lord, help me. And he saved me and pulled me through. I think God's going to do the same thing with us, no matter what we're going through. Whether we're in the hospital, whether we're, facing surgery, whether we're recovering from surgery, if we're walking through the valley of the shadow of grief, if our offerings are not meeting our expenses as a church, whatever we face as individuals or as a church, if we continue, just like Peter, when he started sinking, to reach out that hand, Lord, save me, then he will do that. So as we go forth from this place into the world for this next week, what's going to happen when push comes to shove with your faith? Is there going to be times when your faith is weak, you falter and fail? Well, sure there will be. But don't worry about it. Jesus is there to catch you by the hand, reassure you, and bolster and strengthen your faith, just like he did for Peter. Go forth from this sanctuary today with your faith strengthened and renewed, knowing that when push comes to shove, God's got your back and you're in his corner. Amen.